Good afternoon, everyone. Realizing that I'm between you and a wonderful weekend, bright sunny skies, we'll start this right on time, or actually right on the reposted time. So thank you very much for coming here on a beautiful Friday afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Brian Fox. Brian is currently a research associate in the Finance and Administration Department for the Oregon University System. It was in this capacity that he was engaged to provide an in-depth analysis of our revenue and cost structures. It's also important to note that he is also providing that same analysis for 3 other universities, and it will be used at many other universities as well. This effort builds on our efforts utilized in the sustainability plan, which utilized the methodology of the Delaware study, among many other tools. His efforts provide us a much more robust look at EOU's fiscal structures and also at a much more granular level. To help frame this report and the subsequent discussions, there are several important aspects to remember and to consider. First and foremost, this is not the end-all, be-all report and tool that will solve all of our issues. It is just that, one tool, one set of data, one way to look at our fiscal structures. This this report will not be the sole basis to make further decisions. It is a tool that enables us to have access to rich data presented in a meaningful way and frame further questions and inquiries. This report enables us to look at our financial structures in aggregate and allows us first to pose questions and to identify opportunities for investment and our other areas for questions and identifying other areas for investigation. This report is a tool that also provides us the opportunity to compare our programs to peer programs at similar institutions on a financial basis. It does not, nor should it be construed to be a vehicle to compare our programs against one another within our university, or to compare our programs at other dissimilar institutions. And it is also not a statement of academic quality. It is a fiscal analysis. This tool also does not measure our mission fulfillment of the programs that we have. It does provide us insights into the financial viability of our efforts. It is important to remember that as a university, we are a collection of many programs that provide and add value to the academic experience. In these efforts, we know and fully realize that some of our programs will have costs that exceed revenues. And conversely, we know that some of our programs will have revenues that exceed cost. What is important is that this report allows us to have a full and robust discussion about the aggregate revenues and expenditures. It also allows us to have a full understanding of the fiscal challenges for certain programs. It allows us to provide us an opportunity to openly discuss these fiscal challenges in balancing all of the programs and needs so that in this effort we can remain financially viable and sustainable as an institution. Today is the initial discussion of this report. Brian will provide an overview of the report and make comments on the various observations he has made through this process. Over the next several weeks and months, the provost, along with the appropriate and relevant dean, will be meeting with each of the programs to discuss and dig deeper into the discussions that occurred last spring and to continue the discussion about academic programming. Steve will also engage the faculty senate as appropriate on the larger academic issues. Myself, I'll be working with budget and planning, and I will utilize this report, among others, to provide insights and guidance as we prepare for the fiscal viability and sustainability of our university. I also want to point out that this discussion is being recorded and will be placed on our budget website along with the full body of the report, and also is being webcasted throughout our academic community. So with that, Brian, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, President Davies.
Is that on?
I hope so. Can you guys hear me? I'll talk louder if not. So I don't have a whole lot of practice lecturing, but I do have a decent amount of practice in discussion. So if there are questions, stick your hand up. Let's talk about these things. If there are clarifying remarks or pieces that you don't quite understand, push on me a little bit so that we all can be on the same page as we walk through this. There's a lot of kind of complex information that flows through here, and so some of it I've tried to aggregate up in a meaningful way, but if there are questions at the underlying data, then let's ask them so that we can all be on the same page. And I think the most important piece is to establish that sort of the truth in the data, and then we can walk up into what those conclusions are or what that looks like in aggregated or disaggregated forms, so then we can make sort of rational choices going forward. I recognize this, sorry, there we go. Okay, it is better picture up there than on here. I recognize that you're probably not going to be able to read everything that's up here. So if you have questions, or I may just be spitting out numbers and pointing at little areas. So ask me to slow down at times if necessary. So I'm going to how do we do this? Walk through the agenda. The first off, I'm going to walk through what the Delaware cost study model is, what this report does in addition to that, the process of gathering data, the purpose for it, the leverage points that it lays out in managing a university and managing different departments, and how that flows through both on the operational side and how that pushes through onto the financial side. I'll push that down both the EOU as a whole and then its component units, the two colleges, and then underneath that I'll have some example departments so we can see areas where different leverage points are at play, so we can understand how that's likely to flow through into the financial results. And you'll see some pretty tight linkages between the two. And then last, I've got some campus-wide measurements so that we can look where money is flowing through, where different operational targets play out, so that we can understand as an entire campus, what do these things look like, where do certain cross subsidies exist, where did different operational patterns flow through, so that we can really understand, okay, here's where we are departmentally, here's where we are as an aggregate, and where do we need to kind of utilize these leverage points to get to, so that in the long term we can have a financially viable and sustainable and in fact thriving university, which can happen. It just is a matter of getting kind of all the ducks in a row. There we go. So the process, I spent the summer out here doing first study in the 2011-12 academic year to kind of understand the data, get a sense of what the campus looks like, what the information looks like, and then went live with the 2012-13 data once it was available to me. The pieces that are in there are CRN level data, so what classes are there, who's teaching what students are in it. Like, you can link all that information together, and really the operative unit is that CRN, or the class section. Create a scorecard, which you'll see in a minute. That's really sort of the aggregated up data information that I have one for each of the departments, or some aggregated departments, and then for each college, which rolls up, and then both of the colleges roll up into the university writ large. Next piece is to combine the data, see where your course level data and your load information may not necessarily comport directly with the accounting information. They're two different systems, so you're going to have to kind of make sure that those match, and then scrub or clean the areas where they don't, make sure that all the buckets align. Underneath that is you calculate the cost and revenue pieces, and I can walk through how that's calculated. Associate them into departments, and then build those pieces up. And then you take a look at it. Once you have it done, and you say, where did these things lay out? What makes sense? And then the last piece has been kind of a back and forth between me and the executive team and the deans to see, what makes sense, what doesn't, what do I need to relook at? And that's another question that comes up here. If there's further analysis that needs to be done, I'm happy to do that. But it's good to have everybody in a room and formulate some questions so that we can get answers in and be as helpful in the process that lies ahead of us. So some definitions. Again, I think it's important that we walk through the data at a tight level. So a tenure track faculty member, I think that's relatively self-explanatory. There's kind of two operative units for faculty, tenure track, and then what I've lumped into other. That other category includes adjuncts, fixed terms. If the provost who has taught classes, if he teaches a class, he's in that other group. I know that he is a tenured faculty member, but he's an administrative faculty member. However, I'm not charging any of his costs to a department. So there are folks, basketball coach, not charging his costs unless he's paid overload directly for a course, though he's associated with several CRNs. Those are just sort of kind of one-offs you have to deal with. But I thought that it was good just to lump into two broad categories, this adjunct or fixed term kind of other folks, and then your tenure track lines. One faculty FTE is defined as 45 load credits. Per the collective bargaining agreement, there's an expectation of 36 teaching load credits, typically, and then 9 additional service units. So one FTE at the faculty level is 45 load units. How that is dispersed between teaching and service is a part of how you formulate what costs, and the cost being salary and health care or insurance, retirement, Social Security, all those little pieces that are either paid out directly to the faculty member or come through as benefits, how those are apportioned between service and teaching. An organized class, or OC, as you'll see that designation a lot through here. An organized class, a general lecture style format, anything that isn't, I culled out research classes, lab classes, independent classes, capstones, so things that have kind of non-lecture components. If you have a student or several students in one class, there's only a few of you, the CRN wasn't created by the registrar 3 months ago, but was something that was kind of created now to serve a special need, that got lumped into this section because I felt like those are two separate things. Oftentimes those don't have a load credit associated with it. Load credits come directly from the colleges, so they have provided me and now the central system, we've agreed on how to structure this out, so the load information for a course, whether it's in-load, overload, hourly or summer or other, those things, that information gets centrally collected and attached to a CRN, so that information is tight and good. Went through individual instructions. SCH, you'll see that designation a lot and you'll probably hear me talk about it. One SCH is a student credit hour. If one student takes a 4-credit class, there are 4 SCH that are created for that. 180 SCH to graduate typically. Some departments have SCH requirements, so that's what an SCH is. It is the operative unit for students. The CRN is the unique identifier created by the registrar's office for every class. The student FTE. At the undergraduate level, one student FTE is defined as 45 student credit hours. That's a university system-wide designation. It's used at each of the 7 public institutions in the state. At the graduate level, it's defined as 36 student credit hours. Faculty FTE went over. It's in there twice. RAM, the resource allocation model. You hear me discuss that at some point as we kind of move later down. That is the state allocation is driven, at least part of the state allocation to universities is driven by student credit hours, student and what area and what level they're in. So a student in 100 and 200 level courses is funded at a different level than a student in the 300 and 400 level courses. Same, and a student in the 5 or 6, 7, the graduate level courses is funded differently. And students in different subject areas are funded differently. So a student in a high cost area, biology, hard sciences, engineering, etc., has a higher RAM cell value than a student in a low cost major. Those cost allocations were decided by somebody above my pay grade and many years ago, and that's just been the funding mechanism. But you'll hear me talk about RAM funding and state appropriations. Those can flow directly and do flow directly into CRNs, so we can measure them by CRNs. Non-credit bearing activity. So you heard me discuss earlier the aggregate of faculty FTE being 45 load credits. Typically, there's a 36 credit load expectation for tenure track faculty members. That additional 9 credits of service is lumped into this non-credit bearing activities. If a faculty member teaches less than 36 SCA or 36 load units or load credits, then the delta moves up into that. So anything below at the 45 upper limiter and down to what a 1.0 FTE faculty member teaches, the difference there is non-credit bearing activity or non-SCH producing expense. I use that term throughout. Direct expense, which I can tie to a CRN and then aggregate up to a department, is once again that salary and OPE portion within the faculty. Other expense is S&S, paper, pens, highlighters, staples. I don't have utilities in here, but I do have S&S budgets that are directed down to departments. Overhead expense, all non-direct education in general expense. So this excludes the auxiliaries, which is housing and dining, athletics, those pulled out. All that this focuses on is the education in general section, the core operating mission of the university. Questions? Okay. There we go. So this is completely illegible. This is what the scorecard looks like. I'll move, I think the next slide has one. So this is what the scorecard looks like. I know that you can't read it. In the upper section is kind of the aggregate of a department's information, on the far left being faculty FTE, which we've discussed the definition there. In the middle, these two sections there and there are the student credit hours produced by level, whether it's sub 100 level remedial courses, lower division, upper division, individual credits, and then graduate. On the far right-hand side, far left-hand side, you'll see organized class sections. Or you can't see, you're gonna have to trust me. They'll say organized class sections, and that's how many classes were offered over the entire year. And again, that's broken up both by the faculty class, so tenure track, other, etc., and by the level. So if it's sub 100, 100, 200, 300, 400, sort of lower division, upper division, and graduate. So then you can start to look at how many courses are being offered, by whom, and how many students are enrolling in those courses. On the left-hand side, right below where you see those two red boxes, that's where you trace in direct revenue, RAM appropriations, then you can get total funds flowing in through a department or into a particular class. Underneath it are direct expenses, so that's salary and OPE dedicated to a faculty member to teach a course. And this is driven down to the course level by taking, you've got the amount of salary that comes in, you split that into two pieces, or you split it into several pieces because there's overload pay, which comes through a particular account code, and summer pay, which comes through a particular account code, and then sort of general faculty pay, which comes through another account code. That piece, lump it on with healthcare and benefits, and you separate that into the two pieces, right? In load, the teaching, the SCH bearing expense, and then the non-SCH bearing expense, the piece that goes towards service. Oh, thank you. All right. In this box down here is your cost per SCH. And this is really the focus of the Delaware cost study. What they want to do is track costs and deliver a cost per SCH, and that's where you can make nationally normed comparisons. To that, I bolted on this cost revenue piece. It's something that they don't look at. Down here is a combination of this SCH data and the course data by faculty level. So you can see in load, lower, right there is in load lower division courses, or the number of SCH per in load lower division course. Next to it, the number of SCH per upper division tenure track course. So you can see how many students are being taught in every type of course as you walk through it. Next to that is a faculty productivity piece. SCH per full-time faculty and students per full-time faculty. So you have one FTE student, 45 SCH or 36 if they're graduate, per one full-time faculty member, 45 load credits. This number this number actually overstates the student to faculty ratio because I've pulled out a significant amount of FTE from the tenure track lines for that non-service piece. If you lumped that in, you would get head count faculty. But what I'm looking at is FTE faculty. So I want you to know that though this number, which I'll read it to you, it's 14, see how good my eyes are, 14.1 or 14.5, hold up right here. Sorry, I can't read it. It's 16.8. There we go. So you got 16.8 students per faculty member. And that number, once again, is actually overstated because you've got out of, so you have 50, that number right there is 54.4 FTE faculty in the tenure track lines in teaching. Down here in non-service or non-SCH producing expense, you have 44 FTE faculty. So that's 16, if you lump the full 100 in, would be significantly lower than that. So now I'm going to walk through what I view as the leverage points where this report kind of lines out how you can manage and shape departments, manage and shape your enrollment to drive operating results. So the first one is this upper and lower division split. So traditionally in a liberal arts institution, you'd want to see what I view as the pyramid. At the lower piece, the base of the pyramid, you have lower division courses, where students come in, they take a myriad of courses so they can experiment, understand what's out there, get a sense of the academic disciplines, kind of the core piece of a liberal arts education, where you have develop that broad understanding what it means to be a citizen, etc. And then you dive in to in-depth study of one particular department or one particular focus area, and you develop a mastery in that area, and that's the core of a liberal arts baccalaureate degree. What you see at EOU is actually an inverse pyramid, and hopefully those numbers are big enough to read. In the upper division, you see 1,190 to almost 1,200 classes offered. In the lower division, you see 950. These lab sections, capstones, etc., you see a significant amount of those, which are traditionally under or very low enrollment courses. So you see here, instead of that pyramid, you see an inverse pyramid. So there's a couple pieces that can cause an inverse pyramid. One is the student body. A university begins to rely more and more on transfer students who are coming in from a community college where they've taken the first 1 or 2 years worth of classes. They necessarily will need less lower division courses and will take more and more upper division courses. So that can cause that skewing when you have actual demand, but only in one area or in one sort of portion of your curricula. Another piece of that can be what's discussed as curricular sprawl, where within a department more and more classes are added or more and more focus areas are added without paring back other areas and without enrollment actually showing up to it. And so that's where you see low enrollment courses and the curriculum just sort of growing. So the next leverage area, and that really the function of that is what courses are being offered. That's how you manipulate this lower upper division split. The next leverage piece is that faculty productivity part that I pointed out. And this is your student credit hours per faculty and your students per faculty. And this is driven by enrollment and the courses offered. So if you want to adjust this, if you want to adjust your faculty productivity, what this is measuring is how many students are coming in the door and how many faculty do you have to teach them. So this is a capacity question, right? Which brings up the next one, which is enrollment per class section. So this is broken up into several areas. You've got your tenure track lines, and that's broken into your regular in-load and then overload summer, your regular faculty and then summer. And then over here you have how many folks are in that class. So I've broken it into sections of 1 to 10, of 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and over 30. And so what you'll notice is a significant amount of the courses offered at Eastern lies in this bucket of 1 to 10 students. It's important to note that this excludes lab classes. This is only regular organized classes offered. General lecture style, online classes, ones that that you think about when you think of what a college course is. So this excludes all those sort of, not extraneous, but the ones that are focused on individualized instructions, which certainly have their purpose within a liberal arts institution. What you see also, very, very few courses with many students in it. So you notice this skewing of students into lower enrolled courses. I think that Provost Atkinson has discussed this at length, at least with the deans, and I believe in a memo that was sent out to the campus, how the sweet spot for a lecture-style course at an institution such as this is somewhere between 24, 27, at least in between 20 and 30. And that's an area where it becomes financially sustainable to offer a course. And as you'll notice, there are very few courses actually being offered within that range. The next graph, which I've gotten some flack over for it being a line graph and not a bar graph, so I'll start that out and our graph experts can push on me there. This is a graphical representation of that former number box. So again, you see the predominantly courses are offered in these sections right here from 1 to 10 and 11 to 20, with very, very few courses here. Ideally, in an institution, in a liberal arts institution such as this, you'd like to see something of a bell curve. Very few courses offered with 1 to 10 students, especially in general lecture style courses. A few in here, in your upper division courses, your more advanced courses. And then most over here, with a few in this, in the large course section. One of that is going to be capacity constrained, and the other is a pedagogical thing, right? You probably can't have a discussion if you have 60 folks in your class. But you probably hit that sweet spot right in here where you have mid-20s, right? And not just financially, but pedagogically. If you only have 8 students in a class, it's hard to have a discussion, right? Because you've got probably one kid that dominates and a lot of kids who are silent. But if you have enough students in there, you can get a diversity of opinion and lead a discussion. So that's leverage point number 3. And then the last one is this non-SDH bearing expense. And this is where it shows up as 44 faculty FTE. And the dollar value that's associated with it, and you can't read it there, but you can there, is $4 million. It's $4 million worth of payroll expense at this institution directed in the tenure track lines alone that's going to non-SDH bearing expense. And naturally, second order questions flow from that. What is being purchased with that expense? Is it faculty governance? Is it recruitment and retention efforts? Is it meaningful scholarship and research? Is it service to the community and service to the university? So I think that that's the operative question when you look at here is, what are you buying? And I think now we're talking about where the revenues come from. And I mentioned one is this RAM funding. Those are state tax dollars. The other piece is tuition. By and large, tuition comes from student loans. That is especially true at an institution such as this, where many of the students come from low socioeconomic backgrounds and are struggling to make it through school as it is. The dollars that flow into this institution, once again, are state tax dollars and student loan dollars. So the question is, what are you buying with that expense? And is it worth those tax dollars? And is it worth those student loan dollars? So now we're going to look at some institution-wide results at EOU, and then we're going to drive down to the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Education and Business. It is natural that there will be differences within departments and differences within colleges of what the results look like. So you have within the education and business, education largely a graduate program, right? It will naturally look different than a predominantly undergraduate program. Business, a professional school which largely draws from draws upper division students, right? You take your first 2 years, core liberal arts classes in the College of Arts and Sciences, you dive over into the business program. Makes sense. And you'll see this difference within particular departments where you have what I call, and this is probably an inarticulate term, but service departments, which may have few actual graduates, but serve the broader university community. I think the perfect example there is mathematics. Everybody's got to take a math class. Not everybody's going to be a math major. So it's reasonable that they will have that inverted pyramid that I talked about. In fact, it should be a very, very inverted pyramid. We have a lot of folks coming over and taking math, 101 or 249 or whatever it is. A lot of folks coming over and taking those classes. You probably have few folks taking advanced, quadratic equations, or I wasn't a math major, so some math faculty can help me there, but taking advanced level mathematics. Okay, makes sense. There's going to be a difference there. You have other departments, sociology, anthropology, tends to graduate a lot of folks. It would make sense then that they probably have a little bit of an inverted pyramid if folks are taking other courses and moving over. Differences will exist. It is rational, right, and reasonable that there should be cross-subsidies then between different departments. It makes sense that some departments with many high enrollment courses would have excess revenue beyond cost coming in, and then those dollars would be plowed back into mission attainment activities in other departments. So we get to the results, and I recognize that these are not readable. So I'll kind of walk through what I have, and hopefully for the folks online, they can zoom in. And if not, I'm sure that we can get the report out to folks so that you can dive into it. And once again, are there any questions? I guess I'll take a little break. Okay. Grab a little water before we get going. So some of these we've already seen or I've already highlighted. The first being the very high non-SCH bearing expense. So 44 out of roughly 100 FTE in the tenure track lines are dedicated to non-SCH bearing expense, or non-SCH bearing activities, which drives that almost $4 million, or a little over $4 million in expense. Over here, you'll notice that there's a significant amount, and it'll be much more clearly visible in the graph that comes up next. There's a significant amount of very low enrolled courses. Your student-to-faculty ratio, as you'd expect, given that number, is not particularly high. In fact, at the top in the tenure track in-load line, it's at 16.8, and it ranges down to 11 during the summer term. The next, an interesting piece at Southern, and this is, or excuse me, at Eastern. So I was at Southern doing a similar presentation on Wednesday. So, is this in-load, overload summer. So the structure of how classes are funded at this university, you get your salary, right? Folks come in, they agree to X salary line, and that's split up between your load units. Beyond that, there's a significant amount of overhead that's offered. Per the contract, overhead is paid per head. So if a student is, or per SCH. So if you have 20 students at $49.75 a credit hour, 4 credits, that's 80 times 49.75, which is higher math than I can do on the back of my hand or back of my mind, but it's a decent amount of money, and then that's what the cost side is. That's what a faculty member is getting paid. So what you see here, what you'd like, is that most of your in-load classes should be relatively high enrolled. You've got a fixed cost there, what we're paying folks. Those should be the core pieces to the education, and those should come in the in-load sections. If there's an extra class that is low enrolled that needs to be added on for excess students, maybe that's the piece that should be overloaded, and that's a negotiation that needs to happen within the departments. And what you see at the aggregate level in at least the upper division, and you'll see this in different departments to varying extremes, is that the overload average student credit hours per class is 76 when it's paid overload, but in-load is only 48. So it's showing a skewing between in-load classes and overload classes. So the classes that are being paid per head tend to have higher enrollments. The classes that are being paid, this is X, this is what you're going to be paid for it, tend to have lower enrollments. That drives a significant amount of the cost issues at the university. The other pieces that need to get brought up are a significant amount of lab classes. That number is 627 out of roughly 3,000 courses. It's roughly 20%, a little over 20% as I do my math. And once again, you see this inverted pyramid with only 950 courses in the lower division and almost 1,200 courses in the upper division. Down here, this number, and again, I recognize that you can't read it, it's your cost per degree, and it's roughly $19,851, so roughly $20,000 cost per degree. Total degrees granted last year were 680. When you look at the number of degrees granted per tenure track faculty member, which is this box down here, you see that there were 6.9 degrees per faculty member last year. I don't have nationally normed data for what that sort of ought to look like, but I think it's an interesting number to say, how many faculty does it take to produce X amount of degrees? It appears like you get 6 degrees out of one, or 7 degrees out of one faculty member here. Next, we're going to move on to the College of Arts and Sciences. I guess we'll go to that graph, and again, you can see very tightly that the bulk of enrollment sits in these lower enrolled courses, or the bulk of classes sits in these low enrolled courses. Moving on to the colleges, College of Arts and Sciences, which is by far the largest, or is the largest of the colleges, houses most of the SCH that is produced. And what are the issues that you see? You see a significant amount of this non-SCH bearing expense. That's 25.7 FTE and a little over 40 FTE in the inload section. You see a skewing here of what's inload and what's overload, where once again you see low enrolled courses are inload and high enrolled courses are overload. You also see that the fixed term faculty or the adjunct faculty, non-tenure, tenure track faculty, tend to teach bigger classes than the tenure track faculty. See 4.9 graduates per faculty member in the College of Arts and Sciences. Again, think of the leverage points here. You probably have a significant amount of students that are taking 1, 2, maybe some 300 level courses here and then shifting over to business or education. And so it may be natural that that is lower than the institution mean. Question is how much lower is right and reasonable. Again, you see a significant or a bulk of the class sections are offered in very low enrolled courses. And a relatively high cost per degree at $28,000. Yes?
Can you offer an explanation? Keep going with the non-SCH expenses.
Yes.
And the example you gave for that was the difference between the 45 load credits and the 36.
Yes. Yes.
So that's a 20% versus 80%
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah.
So why are non-SCH costs comparable to in-load costs?
So
Apparently about 20%.
the reason why, and there's actually a graph at the end, and I can scroll forward to that if it's worth looking at, and actually it may be worth looking at now. The reason why is release time, or courses that are or folks that aren't making it all the way up to that allotted contractual amount that is expected of them. And in fact, you see a significant amount of this. So each blue line is a tenure track faculty member. The red line is at 36 load credits. That would be your typical expectation of teaching credits for a tenure track line. The dotted line up at the top is at 45.
But hang on that graph for a second.
Yep. So that space there is what?
Seeing in the chart is almost equal numbers, right? Equal costs in load versus
Yeah.
non-SCH. But that would mean that the blue area there should be roughly the same as the other area.
Yeah.
It would be that the blue area is slower.
So the difference is that there's significant expense that cannot be related to SCH. Sabbaticals, which don't produce SCH. Stipends that aren't related to, they don't produce SCH. So there are other costs that are lumped into that non-SCH bearing expense that bring that up. But those other costs are ones that can't be reasonably related to a course. Yeah.
And are all of those shown in your graph full-time tenure track?
That's the piece. So I'm going to suspect that probably this one is not. And probably, maybe those two aren't. After that, the bulk of them are. And this number comports with the numbers that the deans have for how many faculty are out there. So other questions? And we'll come back to this point at the end. Yes, sir.
Can you break that down? So how are they coming out to 36? It's just because of enrollment?
Well, so that is a question, right? This naturally brings a capacity question. Maybe there aren't enough classes to be taught, but if that was the case, why is there so much overload being expensed?
No, does that say that we're teaching X number of classes, but the student enrollment in those classes brings that?
No, so this is not related to student enrollment. This is related to the load credit given for a course. So a course, regardless of enrollment, is chosen to be in the negotiation between a faculty member and their department head or the dean's office. Is this inload? Is this overload? What is the typical load credit associated with it? Generally, the hours for a course. So if it's a 4-credit course, it's a 4-hour course. That correlates to a 4 load credit course. Lab classes, typically lab classes here are given at full hours. So if it's a 3-credit lab, you get 3 load credits for it. There are some exceptions for high enrollment courses. English courses tend to get an extra bump up. You have 5-credit courses here, so those get 5 credit hours or 5 load hours. So that's how those are determined.
Peter, sometimes an individual faculty, of course, release time, we're doing something.
Yep.
That's what she wants, the release time primarily.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
release time for
Yeah.
so they're teaching 7 classes and they're teaching 5.
Yeah.
That's what it's looking at. That's the gap.
Yeah. So thank you. So it's underage and it's release time, which is a significant amount of it.
I don't think the UWR credit is being counted.
I don't.
You get a load credit for UWR, but it's not tied to any CRA.
Then it probably is not. I don't know what UWR is. But
Writing intensive class.
no, it is. Those were given in the colleges. We gave them a sheet with each of the CRNs and asked them to bring back relating to the load sheets for each faculty member. So writing intensive courses were given an extra bump where that was given on your load sheets.
Well, that's for writing,
Yeah.
but not for the other UWR. That's what I want.
Well, if the colleges have that information, so if they gave a faculty member a load credit for it, it would be reflected for a writing intensive course. If it was reflected on your load sheet, it would be reflected in this information. Yes?
So let me make sure I understand. These are all of the faculty in art and sciences?
No, this is all of the faculty in the institution. Tenure track.
And am I understanding this correctly? Less than half of those faculty are teaching 36 load credits?
Yes, sir.
And that is because more than half are receiving release time?
I don't know. So in the underage, we don't have a tracking system for. And so what is being produced or coming out of that underage, we don't know. I mean, that is a significant question.
And only 4 individuals in the entire university are teaching more than 36 credits?
Getting paid overload.
More than 4 are getting paid over.
Yes. Well, and that's the thing, is there tends to be a cap at that 36, and then anything above is getting paid out.
And only 4 individuals?
Yeah.
I don't think that's correct.
No, that is 4 individuals who are not being overloaded with those credits. This is not
Yeah.
overload, they're already,
Yeah.
they're going into their, if you will, the 9 credits of service.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to head back to the College of Arts and Sciences. So when we get, and forgive me if I went over stuff here, I think that I basically finished this up with the faculty productivity and the low student credit hours per faculty member, a low student to faculty ratio here. And once again, in that graph, you see a skewing to on the right-hand side or left-hand, to some side. The lower side is where you see that skewing at low enrollment courses. Yes?
That's a good question. So you're talking about the SCH, the 9 credits over.
Yeah.
What's the comparative to other institutions? Is the claim that there's too many tenure track faculty and not enough adjuncts to balance out that amount? Or, because you're talking about the $4 million that happens in those 9 credits.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a standard thing that happens across every institution? Or is it a disparity because there's more tenure track faculty and not enough adjuncts? Or why? It just seems like any institution that has tenure track faculty is going to have that issue.
So you do see that at any institution. I don't have nationally normed data. I do have information for one other institution within the university system that I've completed it for. So you will likely see that, right? I mean, most tenure track lines will have this service credit piece. It's a piece of sort of the historic norms in the academy. The question is, how much is reasonable? How much can an institution afford? And what are you getting out of that service credit or getting out of that underage, right? Well, that's a question for the deans and the administration here. It's probably a policy question that's above my pay grade. You know, all that I can do is lay out the numbers, which naturally beget questions, right? Yeah, I think that's a piece of the campus dialogue that needs to happen. So next is we move on to the College of Education and Business, and the College of Education and Business, and in most institutions you see education and business not in the same group, and so certainly they're very different in their character and nature, and also lumped under this college is health and physical activity, health and PE. And so you have really like 3 major units embedded underneath this, each of which is very different from the other. And so the aggregate figures may not tell you a whole lot as like a management scale, but it's worth looking at this half of the college. Let me get to the right slide here. And so once again, let me go back. The bottom line figure for net revenue in the College of Arts and Sciences is a loss of $2.2 million last year. So the revenue in was $2.2 million less than the cost associated with running the College of Arts and Sciences. And that excludes actually the expense in the dean's office, which is embedded in overhead. So it is in there to some degree, but it isn't directly tied. So when you go over to College of Education and Business, back to the slide here, not that one. What you see, once again, a decent amount of lab classes, 167 out of 1,200, but a little over, it is 12% roughly, 12, 13%, which is significantly under the university average of roughly 20%. So you see, though, a significant amount, less of them. You see a drastically inverted pyramid here that I talked about, with only 176 lower division courses, many of those housed in health and PE, but 606 upper division courses, and that naturally corresponds with the component units, right? When you have business, which is largely an upper division sort of department, and education, which is largely an upper division or a graduate program. So those numbers kind of make sense. Piece that you also see is that, once again, a significant amount of the courses offered are in that 0 to 10 student range, or 1 to 10 student range. All the classes with 0 people weren't included. So you see that, once again, you see a skewing to lower enrollment courses. The student to faculty ratios are relatively low in this department as well, in the tenure track in-load line at 16.9 students per 1 faculty. Once again, this is $1.9 million in non-SDH bearing expense, so you see a significant amount of non-SDH bearing expense. The interesting pieces here are in the tenure track in-load and the tenure track overload. You see that low enrollment courses, by a significant skewing, are smaller than overload courses, where there's only 89 SDH in a typical lower division tenure track in-load course. There's 113 SDH in a typical overload tenure track course in the lower division. For upper division courses, it's 62 student credit hours per in-load, and it's 90 student credit hours per overload. So once again, you see a skewing where in-load courses tend to be significantly smaller than overload courses. And again, you see that graph where a bulk of the enrollment, or the bulk of the class sections offered, tend to be in low enrollment courses. So, yes?
Did I hear you say that you include 0?
No, it's not. It's just written, it's mislabeled. It should be 1 to 10. Okay. So 0 enrollment classes were excluded in the sample set. Good question. So sample departments, and these were just kind of cherry-picked to look at different leverage points in here. If you're interested, I've got the stuff here. We can go through each department if we want to sit here all day. But these are some departments that I think are interesting as you look at those different leverage points at play, and how that can drive, how the operational performance and the enrollment choices dictate the financial performance, and that tight relationship between the two. So we're going to start with anthropology, go to chemistry, theater, and business. Yes?
Before you go there, what is the net revenue for the other college? You said for Cass it's minus 2.2 million.
Yes. So for Cass, it's minus 2.2 million, and I can pull the exact numbers up here. So Cass is minus 2.2. And then for business, College of Education and Business, it's roughly $200,000 to the positive, or $186,000 to the positive. And the net loss in E&G to the institution last year is the net of those two things at just over $2 million, $2,015,000.
Then why are we saying, would not if those are correct,
Yeah.
would not the college have closed down 4 years ago?
So I guess we can do kind of a quick financial accounting lesson here. So you have a balance sheet, right? And on that balance sheet, you build up in a private firm, it would be retained earnings, right? In a sort of a nonprofit or a government firm, you have net assets. And so you build up a net asset. And I actually think of these things as a river and a lake. So you have revenues coming in, is the river coming into the lake. You got a dam, and then below it are your costs going out. And within that lake is that balance sheet, right? Or is that net assets. So every year you don't have to cover your expenses. But over time, the amount that's coming out the bottom of that dam needs to equal the amount that's coming in the river at the top, or it gets pretty dry, right? So at some point, if this trend continues, and we can talk about what the drivers for this trend are, one of which is the cost side, one of which is the revenue side, over time, if a persistent condition exists in which the revenues are less than the costs, the institution will close. You will run out of funds, the doors will close.
So it is not true that we are losing $2 million a year.
No, that is true. The net delta between the river coming in
I gotcha.
and that going out is $2 million.
If that were true again, the fund balance long ago would have been high.
So what has happened, and I mean this is a little bit outside of the scope of this report, but what has happened over time is that there was a growth in enrollment. So higher education is what economists would call a countercyclical good, or an inferior good, which is sort of a pejorative term, but it's not value laden. It just says the orientation of a good to the economic cycle. So in 2007, 2008, after 7 years of relative growth, the U.S. economy and the Oregon economy with it shifted into a negative, sort of the recession, the Great Recession that we talk about. What happened during that Great Recession? Folks couldn't get jobs, and they went back to school for multiple reasons, to skill up as a place to shelter and wait out a poor economy. So you saw enrollment grow. And in fact, if you look at enrollment growth, you saw an accelerating curve over that time in rough proportion with a decelerating curve of employment. 3 years ago, you saw that curve flatten out and then slowly drop, and now you're seeing an accelerating drop both at this institution and at other institutions within the Oregon University system. Community colleges, which are much more sensitive to the economic vicissitudes, both because they don't have the stickiness of enrollment because it's a 2-year program and not a 4-year program, but also because of the nature of the student, tend to rapidly adjust. And once again, 3 years ago, you saw them begin to move down, and now they've dropped off, and their enrollments that they had built up are back down to their sort of historic levels. And that's something you got to think about, is when there's growth beyond the natural, sort of the natural factors, right? If it pushes beyond that, there's one of two things happening: either a secular shift in the tastes of individuals, or there's a response pushing it and it will fall back to the mean, right? What we're seeing right now is a fall back to the mean.
But I think what Donald's asking is, we've been losing $2 million for the last few years, but we weren't losing $2 million 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah, no, over time, so what has happened, frankly, is that the university system in the state has shifted funds over to deal with that, to ameliorate one-time losses, with the expectation that those one-time losses would cease and would not be a persistent condition. And that's why you've seen subsequent reorganization plans of this institution.
It's fair enough to say that 5 years ago we weren't losing $2.2 billion.
Yep.
10 years ago we weren't. I mean, the numbers were different.
The numbers were different. There has been a persistent loss at this institution that has been ameliorated in certain ways. And then that revenue piece for the last few years was offset by that growth in enrollment, right? And growth in institutions, growth in revenue tends to mask problems, right? Because you can just grow out of excess revenue is coming in. Once that shifts, it becomes very clear that underlying structures aren't operating in sort of a smooth sense. And that, again, that's sort of part of what is feeding into the issues at play today. Are we good there? Okay. I'm gonna have a little drink of water and then we can move to anthropology.
So your data is based on last year?
Yeah, so this data is based on 2012-13 academic year.
And let me add to that, because I think Peter, I think it was Peter who mentioned it, that if this is the feast and famine cycle that we've talked about over the last several years, we have not lost, as I think Peter said, $2 million for the last 10 years in a row. We've had this feast and then famine and feast and famine. What we're trying to do is say, how do we get to that, as Steve likes to say, that sweet spot of a smooth sailing or at least a proper structure. And that's where this data is very helpful in providing some of the insights and raising those questions about it.
Yeah. And I think that's the way to view this report, is that it sheds light and asks questions. It doesn't give any answers. All it does is ask and pose questions. So anthropology, let me get to the right page once again. So anthropology is actually my poster child for how a department utilizes its levers in a good way. The issues that you do see are a lower and upper division imbalance. And this is likely because this department graduates 60 folks. It's one of the major sort of degree granting departments in this institution. And as a caveat there, you have the liberal studies degree, which graduates the most folks. And so that sucks some degrees away, but that's embedded in the minors, right? So unlike many other institutions that don't have a corollary to the liberal studies degree, the minors are a piece that probably needs to be integrated here when you look at the structure of departments. Because if somebody has to get a minor, it's going to drive those upper division courses. And so that's a piece or a flex point in here that needs to be understood. But what you see is a relatively high student to faculty ratio at 28.5 to 1 in the tenure track inload, but then it decreases for the overload at 22 to 1. So you see on net kind of where it should be, where the high enrollment courses are in those core classes that are being taught in inload, and the smaller courses tend to be in overload. So they're running those flex points right. You have a relatively modest non-SCH bearing expense, and that's inflated because of one faculty in a fairly small department on sabbatical last year. So that number will actually, or it is likely that number will decrease this year. You see a net of $134,000 of revenue beyond the cost for that department, and you see relatively few courses in relatively few courses that are low enrolled, and a bulk of their enrollment, as you'll notice, in this 21 to 30 category. So you see classes really right in that sweet spot. 21 to 30 folks, and that bears out in their student to faculty ratios. The next department to look at is chemistry. So chemistry is a department that would typically be thought of as a service department, where you're not likely to see a huge amount of graduates. You are likely to see a significant amount of folks taking a chem class for their general sciences for their general science credit. You'd expect, chem, biology, etc., to see that. What you see instead of a pyramid here is roughly a box with 21 lower division courses and 25 upper division courses, yet only 4 degrees that were granted. See a relatively high non-SCH bearing expense and a relatively low student-to-faculty ratio with 17.2 students to 1 in the tenure track in load and 14 and 5 and 8 in your overload courses. You see a significant amount of the courses in this low enrollment portion, and that excludes the 40 lab sections that are offered. So not only are the regular courses that are offered in this low enrollment category, there's also a significant amount of lab courses, or lab and individual study courses, and the average enrollment in those, or the average SCH in those, is 3. So next, and I guess the net figure for that is a loss of $250,000. There's
Grant monies for those individuals who have grants counted into this?
So grants were not counted into that, and so that's a piece that there's a contextual information that needs to be looked at outside of this that isn't embedded. In this report for R1 major research institutions, that's a big focus, and it's something that needs to be kind of thought of in parallel. For teaching institutions, it tends to be less of an issue, and so it was excluded from this analysis. So where, and in particular departments, they have grant-funded release time, that should be looked at. And that's a very good question. And that's why, another piece where you've got to look at this with the understanding that, what's the actual situation within our departments? What does this look like? This poses questions and exposes some leverage points there that actual contextual information matters in the sort of eventual analysis. Yeah. And so once again, you see that skewing of class sections to the lower enrollment courses. Now you go to English and writing. In this department at many institutions has a significant and high net revenue. The reason is you expect to see a lot of courses in the lower division that folks are taking at 25, 28, 30 folks a class. That doesn't happen in this institution. The student to faculty ratio in the tenure track line is 14.4 to 1. It decreases, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong department here. See how good my eyes were. 14.4 to 1. Yeah, they worked. Not going blind as quick as I thought. You see a significant amount of non-SCH bearing expense at $380,000. You see 63 upper division courses for a total of 27 graduates. So you have roughly 3 upper division courses for every graduate. See the bulk of courses in the 1 to 10 person range. And this is a department where, as was discussed earlier, an extra credit is given for writing intensive courses. So, and this one that's circled is just the cost per faculty member and per total faculty members for non-SCH bearing expense. So this, to work through that formula, is non-SCH bearing expense divided by total FTE faculty members, including both fixed term, adjuncts, etc., and tenure track, is almost $19,000, $18,700. So the question is, and I put that ratio and built it specifically like that so that you could see what's the cost, if that's embedded in faculty governance or in running a department, what's the cost per faculty member from the tenure track focusing outside of the SCH producing activities, and that's almost $19,000. And if we switch, so again, you see enrollment, though it's a little bit higher than some, you still see it skewed into the kind of lower enrollment classes. The next department is theater. There we go. And so theater, I've highlighted up here, there are 7 graduates total in the theater department, yet there over here are 30 upper division courses. Excuse me. There are 37 lower division courses. So once again, instead of seeing that pyramid, you see roughly a flat box there. You see predominantly the courses that are offered in sections with less than 10 individuals. You see the student to faculty ratio at 11.9 to 1. And this is an interesting point here. 11.9 to 1 for inload. 20.3 for overload. So you see a skewing here with 44 students per class in inload and 65 students per class overload, or 65 SCH, excuse me, it's SCH per class. For upper division, you see 25 SCH per course inload, and you see 59 SCH per class overload. So again, you see a skewing of courses from inload to overload. And over here, you see a very high cost per SCH at $183 in load. The next department is the business department. So I'm going to get to that. And business, as I said, is kind of an interesting department because it's largely an upper division section, and you see that across the academy. So that's that box there where you have 226 upper division classes, but only 66 lower division courses. That's to be expected as folks take those first 2 years in the College of Arts and Sciences, getting that liberal arts core background, and then shift over into a professional school for the degree. So that number, it makes sense on its face. You see, however, a significant amount of lower enrolled courses, but you do see relatively healthy as compared to the institutional mean students per faculty at 19.3 to 1 for the tenure track lines. But again, you see a higher student to faculty ratio in the non-tenure or in the overload section. And those numbers, 113 SCH per course in inload and 175 on average for overload in the lower division courses. In upper division, you see 90 SCH per course, and you see 115 in overload. You see a relatively significant non-SCH bearing expense at over $600,000. That's almost 6 FTE embedded in non-SCH bearing expense. The net for the business school is $176,000. As a reference, and we'll get to this earlier, I computed what your net margin is. Net margin being your revenue divided by the income, or by revenue, and they have a return of 3%. And there's a graph that'll walk through what that looks like for many of the departments. And so let's go back here. You see the business enrollment by class section. This one actually better resembles that bell curve that you would expect, though it isn't sort of perfect, but nothing is. So now we're going to move to kind of the last and concluding section. And I don't know if we have questions now or if folks want to wait a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to walk through some institution-wide results. I haven't done a regression analysis on the first 2 pieces, so folks can push on me there, but I think your eyes can kind of cue through some stuff. And the sample size is probably too small to do an effective regression analysis, lest my econ faculty come after me. So the first one we're going to look at is the cost per degree, and this number can legitimately be skewed because you have some departments that tend not to graduate a lot of folks, but tend to teach a lot of folks, those service departments that we discussed. And I'll look at that per the degrees that are granted, and you'll see the FM per FTE student taught. So you can see this relationship between the number of folks that are moving through that department and the costs associated with running that department. Next, you'll look at departmental cost per SDH, and this is the piece that President Davies discussed. Said, hey, it's probably not reasonable to make a comparison between the theater department and the chemistry department. They have radically different pedagogy, there's going to be a natural difference in expense. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison there. However, it's worth looking at where the institutional mean comes from. Next, you'll see department net revenue. So how much money is coming in, how much money is going out on net, the size of those two rivers. And then you see departmental net margin. So, I mean, the amount, if you have a really big department and you're gaining, X amount, well, there's sort of degree difference, right? If you're a really small department, you can't be expected to have the same income outcome, right? It's just going to be a natural scale difference. So looking at those two in comparison is probably gives you a sense of the income and the scale. And then underneath that is that graph that we saw earlier, which is the load credits by faculty member. So here's your cost per degree. And there aren't numbers here because I figured they would be too small to read. Though with that logic, there shouldn't have been numbers anywhere in this presentation. But you can see the relative size here, with the institutional mean being a little over $20,000 or a little under, roughly about. And so you see some departments, and these are ones that tend to have very few degrees granted: chemistry, music, English, art, modern languages. And you can see numbers there for how many degrees were granted. And you see very significant costs at a little over $160,000 per degree in modern languages, in chemistry at $140,000, music at $100,000. And then you see other departments, business very low, and again, that's a place where you see the leverage points, right? You have a shift of folks coming in just for the last few classes to mop up a degree, going to be lower, right? Because they don't have the embedded expense of those first 2 years of education. This various departments piece, this is that liberal studies major, so it's kind of it's a toss-out for the analysis here. Fire services, a very, very small bolt-on department, doesn't have many embedded costs, so that's probably one that ought not look at. Anthropology, sociology, however, this is a great example right here, where you see a department that is, per the amount of departments here, it's actually relatively high. And you see a relatively low or right on par cost per degree. And again, you see a similar relationship between the cost per degree and the full-time equivalent students that are taught in each department. So you see, barring some exceptions, you see a general trend that goes up, where your cost per degree is relatively low if you're teaching a relatively high amount of students. And that gets to that capacity question. Here's your departmental cost per SCH on average, or sort of the rough cost per SCH across all faculty lines and across the entire school is 110. You see some departments radically different, and if we pulled over that information from the last slide, you'd see kind of a rough relationship once again with low cost, with relatively high enrollments, and relatively high cost with relatively low enrollments. But again, there's a natural difference in pedagogy and natural difference in the classes that needs to be looked at, especially with this information. So there's going to be lab costs embedded and pedagogy embedded in these costs. And so, context matters. And then we get to the net revenue and loss by department, and you see physical activity tends to bring in a significant amount of revenue. Part of that is because you have so many courses that are being taught by coaches. Their expense isn't embedded in general fund; it's embedded in auxiliaries, and so they're kind of getting out without the costs, but are getting the revenue associated. But once again, you see business, anthropology, really strong positive, strong contributors to the bottom line. And if you go back and you look at what is the same between them, you see that you saw relatively high student to faculty ratios, sort of within that 20 to 30 range that is the sweet spot. You've got some departments that are kind of right there on the margin, and then driving all the way over to English writing, which loses a significant amount in education, etc. And now when you look at that on the scale difference, you can see which institutions are bringing in sort of the amount of revenue per, or the amount of sort of net revenue or net gain or net loss per the revenue associated with them. And you see, PE once again very high. You see this collection over here of departments or the College of Education Business on net and where they're at. You see EOU right here. Sorry, I should have put that in a different color so it was easy to identify. And it, in its education in general in 2012-13 academic year, the 2013 fiscal year, lost 8%. Then you see some departments over here that are losing a significant amount. And I think the question that this naturally brings isn't why are you losing money? Because that isn't the purpose of a higher education institution, right? If we were a profit driver, we'd go open a McDonald's. But we're here to educate folks. But the question is, how do we run an institution so that it's lean and mean and can educate folks in a quality way for the least amount of expense? And that's especially important in a time and in a place that has been significantly hit by the vicissitudes of the economy and is likely to continue to suffer. Eastern Oregon is relatively depressed, both relative to the state of Oregon and relative to the nation. And so the students that tend to come here tend to be from low socioeconomic status. And so the responsibility of this institution is to serve those students and to do so within their means. And that's to run the institution as well as possible. And so that means maybe some departments that can drive net revenues in need to do that and will need to pick up more weight. In some institution or some departments that have significant costs associated with them that may never be able to drive net revenue or net gain, they need to tighten up and see where it is that they can run their house well. And that's the real question at play here, is not whether there should or should not be cross subsidies between departments. That is natural to nonprofits. That is natural to universities and ought to exist. The question is how much and in what way. And that's where we get to the slide that we looked at earlier, which is the faculty load or the in-load by faculty member. And so with that, I actually have one more slide with my kind of recommendations, but I think as we've talked through these, do you guys have questions about this information, about the data that I can be of help for? Yes?
I'm often curious about how you handle, the fact that I'm in one program, but say 80% of the students are in another program.
Yep. So what happens, the driver for costs is SCH. So I take a faculty member and I can see, what I do is I take every faculty member and I see how many SCH they're teaching in different categories. So in-load, overload, summer, etc. And then I take the cost associated with those categories. So here's your in-load teaching cost. Here are the SCH taught. And you go cost over SCH taught, and then I appropriate that by class. So that will follow the department. So if a person is embedded in, say, sociology but teaches in history, that cost will follow them to history. What won't follow them is that service credit. That service credit is embedded in a particular department, the department of record for the faculty member. And so is that a piece that needs to get adjusted around based on where folks actually do their service? Maybe. But that's a piece of the data that you just have to aggregate, go with the information that you have, and put it down. So, are there other questions? And I think it's good to get the data questions out of the way so that everybody's in agreement with what's here in the methodology, because those are the pieces that I think I'm best equipped to answer, probably less equipped to answer what happens next or what the policy decisions that need to be made are. Seeing none, I'll hand out the quiz. There we go.
There is one thing I'm learning about that is whether or not you look at, or it's desirable or possible, online versus classroom. Fixed costs.
So that's a piece, because distance ed was rolled into the departments and is being taught, or is being looked at as one department. You may have different methodologies or location of teaching, but it is a class. And so I haven't looked at the difference between online and in-person instruction. Yeah, no, and it might be, and I think that's kind of a pedagogy question that's once again above my pay grade and outside of my expertise. But I agree. I mean, those are the sort of questions that need to be asked and looked at. Yes, sir.
You mentioned, maybe I missed this in the clarification, but you mentioned that you've done the same study at another school within the institution.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the Oregon University.
Yeah.
Can you just sort of paraphrase or give us some general ideas as to how it's compared?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, as with anything, there are idiosyncrasies to individual institutions, right, that will kind of drastically change. So it's not apples to apples. What I can say is this faculty load piece is similar at other institutions. My sense of that is it's a capacity question, right? If there aren't classes to be taught, then you're going to see this underloading. The other piece is that with small departments, you have to have more release time, sort of on average, because there's a fixed cost or a fixed amount of governance and management that goes into running a department, whether you're a department of 3 faculty or you're a department of 45 faculty. And so that piece is exacerbated by departmental structures at small, or that cost embedded is exacerbated by that structure at smaller institutions. And so that graph there is not necessarily atypical, at least at small institutions. The embedded cost is a question, and I think the second order question at this institution is, if there's so much release, why is there so much overload pay and so much adjunct pay? Well, see, but then you go to student to faculty ratios, and you see very low student to faculty ratios, even compared to other regional institutions. And so that makes that premise, or it puts into question that premise.
Well, the difficulty is that any of the courses have traditionally been our campus courses, and our online, or our overlay courses have traditionally been our online courses. Whereas theoretically, we've embedded the online into the campus community. That isn't really in actuality what has happened for most. Most of these low student or low enrolled courses that you look at are serving the on-campus population. And that is, we don't have the numbers on campus to have high enrolled courses for most of the majors. In that sense.
Would also incentivize growth online
Oh, yeah.
because of the pay structure.
Which is gonna change dramatically this year, which will be very interesting to see how your numbers change this year.
Well, and the other piece, the other leverage point there is the maximum enrollments, right? And so will there be more courses offered online even though you've capped the maximum payout, right? So if you can't get paid for 35 students per head, but you could get paid that amount if you capped the class at 20 and split it out into a class of 15 and a class of 10. So there are multiple leverage points to be looked at there that will be interesting analysis, but it'll also drive through quite clearly to the cost side. And at some point, that lake runs dry. And I think that is, to be perfectly candid and frank, the tragedy that faces us is that the state doesn't have the resources and the university system does not have the resources to sustain institutions in small scale that have significant costs beyond their revenues. And now we got a deal.
So, I know I asked you about chemistry, but I want to double check this thought. Money that follows a faculty position or money that follows a department is not actually being put into the,
On the revenue side, no. So grant funds are not being pulled through.
so the $250,000 that is tied to offering
No, no, that's exactly it. So, and that's part of those nuance pieces that was outside of the scope, pulling in those grant funds, et cetera.
Health money and all of the other things
Yeah.
that are actually income to departments but are not.
But that are not embedded. What would happen there is they come through on the E&G side, education and general side, the core operating of the institution. So those are going to flow through as revenues on the E&G side or appropriations, and that'll get deducted out from the costs. So it does come through in a reduced overhead rate, but that applies through to everybody and not just to chemistry. So it is embedded to some degree, but it wasn't directed at a particular function or functional department. Just the sort of informational limitations and ignorance of the person who prepared it. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and that's a real question here is how do your accounting systems follow your operational structures? And this report really tries to combine those two. Any other questions? Yeah.
So privacy-wise, do you have the CRN, the actual individual data points that?
On what?
So I'm just thinking, because one of the things that happened this past year, and it's not inherent in the individual pulling the data, it's just that in how the CRNs are tied within departments, sometimes don't lend themselves well to pulling them out. So CRN, for example, you might have two CRNs for one functional course.
Yeah.
But of course, somebody pulling by CRN wouldn't know that. And so that was.
Sort of a cross-listing issue.
Yeah, an issue with the data set that we had used last year for that sustainability plan is that of these so ever many courses that were identified as low enrolled courses actually existed on paper as low enrolled courses, but didn't.
Yeah, like if you aggregated these two courses that in actuality were taught together, they wouldn't be low enrolled.
I'm just wondering if there's a place where your data set.
So this does not adjust for those, but it can. And that suggestion at another institution that I did, they said, hey, we have all these cross-listed courses. I'm like, okay, that's a piece that I didn't know looking at it. And so that, I think, kind of follow-up review is, can we pull those out or tease those out? Which, yes, we can. I mean, it's more work, but that's fine. I don't mind my weekends. So yes, we can, but no, it doesn't. The thing with cross-listed courses, however, is that the only piece that will affect is right here. Because your student to faculty ratio is based off of your FTE faculty and your FTE students. So it won't affect this piece, and it won't affect the revenue because that all ties through SCH. So though that is an issue, just luck and happenstance in how this was developed, because I tried to push down to the least common denominator, the only piece that it affects is this, and then where that data set is drawn through right here. So, and I think that that is a valuable piece, because if you go to this slide and you say, oh, well, all we have to do is knock out these low enrolled courses, well, if in actuality half of those are cross-listed courses, this number's right here, and then you've got a curve that looks like that, and you go, no, what we actually need to do is maybe focus less here, but focus more on shifting folks from here to here, right? So that though it matters less in the net for this analysis, it matters in the operational framework, right? And that's something that department chairs and deans should have a pretty good handle on. Yes?
How would it impact the data if you could take the CRNs? I might be off, but I believe that CRNs, actually, there's a little bit of a difference between online versus on-campus CRNs. There would be, in theory, although laborious, a way to identify online versus on-campus classes. If you could do that, what would that really look like? What would you want to do with that website?
Yeah, so, and actually, I mean, I have all that information embedded. We went, when we pulled and extracted the data, let's get more, right? Because then you can go back and parse it differently later. So I do have that information. I don't know offhand what that would look like. My sense is that, and
I guess my question is more, what would you want to handle? Like, which pieces of this would you want to look at with that?
well, you get to, and I think that you brought this up, is that there is a legacy tradition that in-load courses are physical courses on campus, with the rolling or in of DDE, that never actually, it doesn't appear that that flowed through into how courses were paid. And so you would see, I suspect, and I do not know because obviously I haven't done this analysis, I think that you would see, you'd see that on campus there is a massive amount of excess capacity, and online you're probably, right where you should be. The cost basis for your online, however, is much lower, but that's a function of having all your a significant amount of fixed costs embedded in very low enrollment courses on campus. But that's speculation at best. Other questions, thoughts, suggestions even? All right.
With that, I'd like to thank all of you for participating. This is, like I said before, just the initial discussion. I think it was a great set of data. It raised a lot of questions, a lot of other policies that come forward. Those will be done through the Office of the Corporate Service Governance Models and through discussions with the specific departments and whatnot. This report and this PowerPoint and the report and the TV show will be posted on the website hopefully by Monday or Tuesday. So again, thank you very much. If you have individual questions for Brian or myself for that matter, Brian's the star, so go to him first. I'm sure he'll stick around and be able to answer those.
Yeah, and here's my contact information. My email's down at the bottom. To me, I both enjoyed creating this report because it's good and useful information, but the most important part is to make this useful and operational so that we can have thriving and succeeding institutions. And so if you have suggestions, constructive suggestions or thoughts, shoot me an email. I'm happy to listen and to hear and to talk things over if you have questions. And I think that cross-listing piece, I will go after this data and see how we can scrub it and deal with that cross-listing piece, because I think that is important to managerial analysis. So I appreciate that, and I think there'll probably be a forthcoming sort of a secondary piece to this with scrub data on that side. So thank you.